Here everyone comes. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a town hall brought to you by Ollie here at UC Berkeley. I'm looking through your pictures right now. I see people who are actually smiling, and that's a rare event in relation to midterms. So it's we're already off to a good start. If I can mention midterm elections and you can keep smiling, I'd say we're doing okay. I am going to just welcome all to you to the event. Get settled in. We take a couple minutes for that, and then we're going to give you basically three different thematic versions of our takes on things to look out for the midterm elections. I will say this: we're not going to address, at least in our opening comments, specific races. For instance, it's not that kind of midterm. You can get that anywhere online. We were trying to offer something that's quite different, and so we're kind of going with what I would call some deep coverage, some thematic things that are definitely in play in the midterms. Of course, if you do have questions about specific things, you should put them in the chat. So the way the town hall will work is that as we are speaking, if you have questions or comments or insights, please feel free to put them in the chat part of Zoom. We are going to try to finish our comments no later than the first half of today's program, so we can leave the second half to respond to your questions or your concerns, and then that will probably take us all the way to 11:30. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in with my comments. Let me introduce who else is here. I'm Darren Zook. You probably know that if you're part of OLLI. I've done a few classes, I'd say, over the last few years. I also teach in political science and global studies at UC Berkeley. Speaking after me is David Hollinger, and he is a very well-known figure. You've probably seen him also in other events around campus. He's the author most recently of a book called Christianity's American Fate: How Religion Became More Conservative and Society More Secular. He'll be addressing the issue of religion. Then after that, our third speaker is Arlie Hochschild, and she is the author, as probably all of you know, of a book called Strangers in Their Own Land: Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And she is currently at work on a follow-up book dealing with the Appalachians, Society in the Appalachians. Both David and Arlie are also emeritus professors from UC Berkeley, so we are strongly representing UC Berkeley today. Okay, so now I'm going to jump right in with my comments, and I'm going to start with letting you all know what I'm reading. I'm reading a book some of you may know of, and it's really comforting reading right about now. I'm reading, oh, you can't see it. Oh, thank you, Zoom. I'm reading a book that's yellow. I'm reading George Orwell's 1984, and it makes for some really comforting reading, and also makes for some very unsettling reading. There's, every page I find myself going, oh, this is right now. Oh, this is so-and-so. So it's, I don't want to say we're in a dystopia, but sometimes it was like when I read Journal of the Plague Year during the pandemic. I was like, oh, somehow this is comforting and also unsettling at the same time. But, in the course of midterm elections, people are saying these midterms are in many ways a referendum, not just on the Biden administration, it's a referendum on American democracy. And to the extent that that's true, I'm going to try to address the question of what is the biggest threat in terms of American democracy. And to my mind, the biggest threat right now is the growing lack of faith in the institutions of governance. And on top of that, there is a growing lack of faith in the institutions of American governance that is also taking on a very partisan hue, so that our lack of faith in the institutions is based upon whether those institutions reflect our own point of view. And I find this actually a rather disturbing development. Let me explain why. Now, I know right now people are saying things like, well, I don't trust the Supreme Court, it's too partisan, it's got too many conservatives. I believe it was Lawrence Tribe referred to the 6 conservative justices as a right-wing Catholic jihad or something of the sort. Should we mistrust Congress? Should we mistrust the executive branch? Is it going for overreach and a power grab? To my mind, actually, the thing that I would personally mistrust most right now, and this is not completely influenced by my reading of Orwell, but it is partly influenced, would actually be political parties themselves. And the reason for that is that political parties, to remind everyone, are actually not institutions of government. They are actually private institutions. It's a peculiarity of the American system that, going back to, quite frankly, the election of 1800, when Adams and Jefferson were duking it out, that the growing sense that the loyalty to a party became more important than it did the loyalty to American republicanism or American governance itself. So parties are basically private organizations that are expressed through public institutions. And I think if we could separate that and remember that, try to draw the partisanship out of there, we would understand that I think a lot of the faith or the lack of faith in institutions of governance that are reflected in the current elections and races would be, I think, directed in the right direction. I'm concerned about the damage, the long-term damage done to the increasing lack of faith that our institutions of governance are worth placing our trust in. Take, for example, something like, so political parties are not institutions of governance, but also something like the Electoral College. A lot of people, if you remember going back to 2016, there was this whole movement about basically we got to get rid of the Electoral College, we can't trust it. But you'll notice the same people who were saying we have to abolish it, or we had the Common Cause was trying to say we need to do one vote, one person. And then suddenly Biden won with the Electoral College, and we never heard any mention of that again. So that's what when I say we trust institutions only insofar as they reflect back what we want to see in terms of our party affiliations or our loyalties. I think we're doing damage. We're complicit in that damage. We're not helping damage. We're complicit in that damage. And so, if I would request anything, and this is just my opening comments, I'm happy to talk more specifics when we get to the question and answer time. It would be to remember as we go into the midterm elections, not to forget what I would call the bigger picture. And the best way for me to summarize that is that party loyalty is always less important than system integrity. If we can all at least vote and participate in a way that maintains the integrity of the system, then regardless of the outcome, in many ways, we all win. That's going to be my opening comments for now. And like I said, if you have questions, comments, you have things I can address or expand upon, I am happy to do so in the second half of today's program. But in the interest of time, I am going to turn the Zoom floor, if that's a thing, over to David, who is going to address the topic of religion. David, it's all yours. Please unmute yourself.
I think what's most at stake in this election is, as so many of our columnists and journalists and politicians have been saying, is democracy and the rule of law. And like most historians, I see the current Republican Party filled with all these election deniers and vote suppressors as the greatest threat to American democracy since the Confederacy was defeated in 1865. I'm not sure how many Americans understand how serious this crisis is. Now, there's a lot being said about this. I just want to focus on one aspect of the threat. I want to talk about the Christian nationalism that journalists tell us is more and more central to more and more Republican candidates for office. And the recent reporting in the New York Times and the Washington Post indicates that more and more Republicans are gravitating to this idea, the idea that the government of the United States needs to be acting in keeping with Christian priorities. So that's a religiously particularist idea, challenging the old church-state separation. These people are constantly saying that we've misunderstood the relation of church and state. And when they talk about Christian priorities, they mean Christian priorities as understood by white evangelical Protestants and to some extent conservative, if not pre-Vatican II Catholics. Now, we all know about the expansion of what is called religious freedom by the federal courts. That's a result of Republican organizing. Religious freedom is now being interpreted as the liberty to discriminate, to circumvent federal guarantees of equality to given classes of persons. Now, what we need to remember is that the courts would not have been doing this had the Republican Party not pushed through judicial appointments reflecting this priority. This happened because of elections. Elections brought this about. And the pundits who are constantly telling us that we shouldn't be so much focusing on the courts but on the political process that develops the who's on the court. They're correct about that. Had the Republicans not controlled the Senate when the federal judiciary was loaded with very conservative judges, this would not have happened. So talking about this is relevant to any election, to past elections, and to this election. And right now, there's a lot of evidence that the Republican Party is increasingly tolerant of, if not a promoter of, Christian nationalism. We need to remember that Bill Barr, President Trump's Attorney General, has spoken repeatedly and explicitly about the need to defeat secular neutralism in government. Barr says we have to strengthen the hand of religion in public affairs, and there's no question about what he means by that. Senator Ted Cruz is constantly talking about this, and his backers in Texas, as revealed by a recent study by the New York Times, now include many dominationists. Now, the dominationists are a subgroup within the Christian nationalists who believe in Christian domination of the entire world and believe that if Christians don't dominate the world, you are not acting on biblical warrant. So there's quite a lot of pressure there. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri is on record as saying that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the entire globe. It is imperative, said Hawley, to bring the rule of Jesus to the government of every nation, including the government of the United States. Now, these are not just yahoos on the sidelines. These are leading politicians, leading the Republican Party of the United States. Now, this talk is not new, but it's never been as widespread in the leadership of a major political party, especially one now likely to control both houses of Congress within a few months. It's come up a number of times. In 1949, the National Association of Evangelicals pushed a constitutional amendment, putting God and Jesus right into the Constitution. In 1854, there was another effort to do the same thing. 41 Jewish organizations lobbied against this because they understood exactly what it meant. Many of the ecumenical Protestants, the liberal Protestants, the mainline Protestants, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and so forth, also opposed it. So the Christian nationalism of 70 or 80 years ago was defeated. It was defeated by political organization and by public argumentation. And the people advancing Christian nationalism did not have anywhere near the tools to support them that they have now. So the situation is now very grave, but at least we have a history of this. Today, our country is facing a remarkable paradox. We have an increasingly secular society as measured by all standard indicators, yet the society is saddled with an increasingly religious politics, and by a politics that is increasingly sectarian. According to all the social scientists that study this stuff, 29% of the American population now professes no religious affiliation. That's a fantastic statistic, given the past history of religious affiliation in the United States. In the Congress of the United States, there are 0.02% people with no religious affiliation. So that's an emblem for this huge gap between the direction of the society and the direction of political institutions. Now, an obstacle to engaging this part of the threat to democracy directly is the taboo against criticizing someone's religious ideas. Now, one might suppose that we lived in a world of either religious ideas are relevant to public policy and thus subject to critical discussion, or they're not relevant and thus not a topic for debate. But instead, we live in a world of both and. Religious ideas are both relevant to public policy, we're told over and over, and they are excluded from critical evaluation. White evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics are free to pursue political initiatives in the name of religious faith, while that faith remains largely protected from critical scrutiny. We remember here a few years ago when Amy Coney Barrett was being discussed by the Senate, and Senator Feinstein, wondered whether or not her Catholicism was relevant. Well, everybody jumped all over. Orrin Hatch said all the Democrats are trying to impose religious tests. So if you raise anything about this, you can be slammed down immediately. Well, you wonder sometimes if we might be able to get away from this old taboo. Now, the tradition of showing respect to someone by refraining from criticizing their religious ideas, no matter how wacky, this feeling has a noble history. It's a legacy from the days when religion was understood as a private concern, like the details of one's marriage or one's bank account. And under the ordinance of this politeness principle, many Americans learned to give religious ideas a pass. In keeping with this tradition, we commonly subject to critical scrutiny ideas about almost everything except religion. If we hear someone say that women can't do first-rate science, or that African Americans are just not as smart as Korean Americans, or that taxation is essentially a form of theft, or that the Americans won World War II with minimal help from the Soviets, or that global warming is a hoax, it's okay to challenge the speaker with evidence and reasoning, not so with any idea presented as part of someone's religious faith. Well, it's easy to disparage the hope for honest conversation. To doubt the power of argumentation about virtually any contested topic is often invoked as a mark of sophistication. Argument in itself is rarely enough in any worthy cause, but without it, we are all the weaker. Forthright debate has been basic to American democracy since Jefferson invoked a decent respect for the opinions of mankind. Democracies disparage argumentation at their peril. To be sure, truth is more easily accepted when advanced by members of one's own tribe. Intellect works best when accompanied by fellow feeling. But tribal epistemologies are not beyond challenge, and tribal boundaries sometimes change. It's all too easy to retreat into ironic detachment and the pseudo-realist claim that argumentation is futile. Sometimes it is futile, but not always. The good things about this republic were made by people who gave it a try. They tried to engage their opponents in honest, respectful, tactful discussion. There's no point in insulting people, but there is a point to engaging them.
All right, thank you very much for those comments, David. Just for the record, you might be interested to know the most common answer among my undergraduate students about religion is that they are spiritual but not religious. So you can make of that what you like. That's the younger generation speaking. But speaking of tactful discussion and getting beyond tribal loyalties, next up we have Arlie, who's going to address that very topic. So Arlie, if you've not unmuted yourself, please do so. And the Zoom screen or the Zoom floor is all yours.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for a very illuminating illuminating analysis of religion. And I'd like to follow up with thoughts about what the talk of religion gets in the way of, what's going on. And I want to talk about social class. You know, when I was a kid, my parents thought that the Democratic Party, most people thought, was for poor people. It helped people and for working class people, and the Republicans were for the rich. It's completely reversed now among a great number of Americans. Recent study found that 60% of all non-college whites and 54% of all rural voters, when asked, well, what's the party that's really fighting for you? Say the Republican Party. Now that's the party of the working people. And the Democrats, well, they're talking about other things. So, and we know that the blue collar has been steadily in the last few years moving to the Republican column. So the question is, what are we doing with this issue of social class? And it's getting, as David said, more urgent, especially if we look forward, what might happen. And this goes to Darren's reading George Orwell. What might happen is that the Supreme Court could say, you know, the whole electoral machinery, that should be turned over to the states. And state governments and local governments are dominated by Republicans. So now is a good time for us to reach across what looks like an increasingly rigid barrier. So what are people thinking on the other side of this barrier? I think a lot of Republicans are feeling that there's a missing narrative actually about social class. They don't talk about it, they talk about religion. But the left, or the Democrats, also don't talk about social class. And here's the paradox. It isn't just Democrats and Republicans. We're two different economies. Democrats are kind of newer industries. Incomes are going up. It's kind of the winners of globalization post-70s. And the Republicans are older industries, more vulnerable to automation and offshoring, and small businesses, rural, and they're kind of downwardly mobile. And there is in certain sectors, prominent sectors of the right wing, a kind of a cascade that has occurred. Plants go offshore, jobs are depleted, wages drop, tax revenues drop, government services are reduced, unions go under. Unions used to be the connector between working class people and the Democratic Party. There's a rural depopulation and diseases of despair. This is one package, a cascade fact that I think the Democrats are not rhetorically or in their narrative addressing. Now, I think the Biden agenda, you know, in very many ways directly speaks to this, but there is not a corresponding narrative. So how is it that we talk across the aisle? I think, first of all, it's to listen, of course, and to acknowledge loss. There is a kind of a logic of loss aversion on the right. And there's something, a way too breezy about the Democratic rhetoric on this. And so the first thing is to kind of listen to that, turn our alarm systems. I know our alarm systems are ringing in our ears, but at the same time, in order to accomplish this, we gotta listen, And that is what you'll hear. The people on the right have not been tuning into the January 6th hearings the way many of us have. They've been checking gas stations for the price of gas. Is it $3.50? Is it $4.10? Should I fill up a bunch of tanks? Or will the price go down? Eggs are $3. Eastern Kentucky used to be $1.50. So they think the left is out of touch with the daily assaults and fears of losing. They're already lost averse. This is one more thing they're afraid of. And so what would you have, who would you imagine you're talking to you're listening, but who would you be listening to? If we put together all of the Republicans who aren't always Republican, kind of shaky Republicans with shaky Democrats, and the 18% of independents, we have a good 45% of Americans. In other words, there is a middle. There isn't a discourse of the middle. And we imagine we're leaping into some QAnon person on the other side. But there is that group. And what would that, if you're talking and listening to that group, what could you say that would ring a bell? You could say, well, you know, I'm worried about this divide. I think we do have a lot in common. And a lot of us are worried about the price of gas and eggs. And we're also worried about a number of other issues. We're worried about, like healthcare. You would find a lot of agreement on healthcare. You would find a lot of agreement on should the government spend money on climate change. Actually, a majority of both Democrats and Republicans say yes, time to do that. Should it put money into renewables? The government should spend for this. Yes. Should it tax the super rich? Yes, it should. Should there be even guns? Should we raise the minimum age to 21 on purchase of guns? Campaign finance reform? All of these, actually, studies are telling us are crossover issues. So it would be a good thing to start with that. Also, there are ways of talking about values apart from, you know, specific things. A lot of people on the right will say, I'm an American, I would die for the flag, I'm a patriot, and the reason I'm a patriot is for freedom. Freedom. Well, that's a crossover issue too, if you talk about it in the right way. In research for Strangers in Their Own Land, I ran across an extraordinary man who was superb at these crossover conversations. His name was General Russell Honore. He was the rescuer of victims of Katrina in 2005. And he one day was talking to a group of Lake Charles, Louisiana business people who were all in the petrochemical industry, but they were big fishermen and hunters as well. And I thought, how is this environmentalist, who's trying to get up a green army, extraordinary man, going to talk across the aisle to these people who were really prepared to oppose him? Here's how he did it. He took what they already felt. They already felt freedom, freedom, freedom. We're for freedom, freedom from taxes, freedom from regulations, freedom. Okay, he said, well, you know, I woke up this morning, I looked out at Lake Charles and I saw a man in a boat. And that man had his fishing line out and he was reeling it in. But that man is not free to lift up an uncontaminated fish he can eat. So what had he done? He'd taken their appeal to their value and freedom, but he connected it to regulations, to the environment. And I saw postures change. He didn't do it by saying you're wrong. He did it by starting with those values. So there are ways and there are organizations, and maybe it's time for us to get busy and try and reach across. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Arlie. We have so much information already out there, and we have questions that are rolling in, and we are almost exactly at 11 o'clock, which means we can just roll right into part 2 of the class. And I'll be taking questions from the chat. I'll get to as many as I can. So let me just jump right in. I'm going to direct these. I'm going to combine 2 questions and direct these at David, because he's come up there while you were talking, David. There's two things. The first one is, what is the speaker's definition of a religious person? I don't consider myself to be religious, don't practice anything, but am baptized and confirmed as Lutheran. And there is a comment just before it, basically recalling that voices of concern were raised when JFK was president because he was Catholic. Whether or not that either presages change, or if you want to clarify any definitions of what you feel, how you would define religion in relation to religion in American politics.
What counts as religion is actually highly contested. And it's therefore, I think, helpful to sort of de-escalate and talk about what these studies measure and what they don't. Now, religious affiliation has to do with whether or not you're really committed to any religiously oriented community. And so when you have, as late as the early 90s, only like 5% of the population not being committed to a church of some kind, and now you have 29%, then that's a change in the extent to which one organizes their life around a religiously defined community traditionally understood. Now, I think a dead end there would be to say, oh, but a lot of these people are spiritual and not religious. Well, that may be true, but if we know anything about the history of Christianity, we know that institutional involvement is central to the hegemony that it has achieved. So what we are experiencing with the decline of religious affiliation is a decided diminution of the Anglo-Protestant hegemony that has defined this country for such a long time. So I don't think it's a matter of my or anybody else defining what's religion. It's a matter of identifying what's being measured. Now, the thing about Christian nationalism is that there you have a very clear sense of what religion is. It's a biblically warranted, ostensibly, license to run civic affairs. So again, now, biblically licensed would be my understanding of what religion is in that case. We don't need to interrogate, what their exact hermeneutic is as to how they're approaching the Bible. They're just claiming it. Now, a big problem often with evangelical preaching is that they will begin by saying, the Bible says, and then what follows is often completely off the wall. So what matters is not so much the truth value in these claims. What matters is the understanding of what the authority is. Biblical authority is being used as the foundation.
All right, thank you very much for that insights and the answer, David. I'm going to direct the next cluster of questions towards Arlie. You'll be happy to know you have a very strong vote of confidence from someone who's saying, how do we get Arlie in immediate position as the Dems election campaign manager? So I'll work on that right away. I'll get back to you later. But there's some interesting questions coming in about, I'm going to kind of combine about three things here. One says, although the Republican Party is now considered the party of the working people, it still is actually subservient to the interests of the rich, and followed by someone saying, I agree, what I don't understand is why that is not seen by those who think the Republicans are for them. And then a bit later, somebody has a personal anecdote about from liberal parents in the South about how conservatives feel looked down upon by Democrats. And I was going to say the same thing growing up in Ohio with Ohio family. There's that sense that the conservatives always feel that the real elite are the liberals. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of tease out this idea of why both sides seem to think the other side is the elites and how we can maybe get around that.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. I think that the Republicans that grassroots folks that I've talked to definitely feel unheard. They feel there is a missing narrative, that they are the crossover state, the crossover people. And they have an ear tuned I've talked to a lot of people whose only source of news seems to be the internet. It's Facebook and no particular newspaper. They'll pick some commentator, the millennials, a young one who's fast talking. And they often don't have real communities, actually. So they really pay attention. So their knowledge of what Democrats think comes from the internet. And there they get the idea that the only thing that Democrats care about is sexual identity, is transgender people in bathrooms. The Republicans, of course, push that. That's all that the Democrats care about. And there's an echo chamber that confirms that to them, or choice or guns. And so they don't think there is a loud voice that is telling them, look, bread and butter issues matter. We have the guy who's addressing them. That's what Build Back Better is. You know, it just isn't a voice. So we need to get a narrative that corresponds to the policies. I don't know if I've answered that, but
I think it's
how we do it. Yeah. I think deep canvassing, People's Action Institute. I love the work Heather McGee is doing. Some of us, the Bridge Alliance, Lean Left, you can join a group and or living room conversations where you get together and actually people are persuaded both by the sense of being listened to, which is a really good thing for us to learn to do.
Darren, can I come in with a comment about this?
And
Absolutely.
Following Arlie there, I think that all these wholesome ideas about dialogue, and Arlie is unusually eloquent in articulating those ideas. A real challenge, I think, is the length of a conversation that we can have. And ideally, in order to draw out somebody with whom you really disagree and you feel that you've got sort of knowledge and insight that you really want to share with them, but you absolutely don't want to insult them or talk down to them. I mean, if you've got a long period of time, you might be able to make some progress on that. And my favorite example of somebody who does that well is Brian Stevenson. This book, Just Mercy, I mean, an African-American political organizer, has had really great success in bringing around white supremacists through the kind of conversation that Arlie is talking about. But a difficulty that we have in electoral politics is that often we only have a few minutes. So if you're doing canvassing, for example, by telephone or face-to-face, there's just not a chance to do much of this. And I find this a really formidable challenge, because sympathetic as I am with these ideas for extended dialogue, I mean, if you come across somebody and they say, well, the first thing is, you know, the price of gas is so bad, so I'm going to vote for all the Republicans. Well, you know, Paul Krugman has a long column in today's Times on how silly this is. Well, we don't want to, you know, talk down to these people. Oh, more of these elite people telling us what the facts are. Well, okay, if you don't want to fall into that, there's a real challenge as to how you can have a conversation that's likely to last maybe 30 seconds, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I throw this out just to say that I'm frustrated by this. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's helpful to distinguish between the opportunities that we have to really go into depth with somebody and to talk for at least 4 or 5 minutes, and then the sort of stuff that we do when we're canvassing. Anyway, just a thought.
Okay, well, you know, for the having a short period of time, I was recently talking to someone who's working with deep canvassing, and she begins by saying, you know, I'm really trying to think, how can we make a better society? You know, a lot of us are kind of not super political one way or another, but we're not happy with what's going. What do you think is needed? You start with, what would you like to see? So you start with, how can we improve it?
All right, it's a good place to start. I will say this, one of the great, I think education is one of the most unused resources, and the luxury that education offers is that you can have a sustained education over a much longer time. So it's unfortunately underutilized right now. It's always a contentious issue, but I can have a 15-week discussion with my students, which is a nice long time to talk about these ideas.
Right.
And I know you all know that. So education is just sitting there as a potential solution, and we just need to make more use of it, I would say.
Right.
I got another question coming in that I will let both of you answer as well. I'll start with David. It's basically saying, aren't faith and religion also a class issue? And the question seems to imply that perhaps faith becomes more important for those lower down the socioeconomic ladder. So that maybe we're perhaps confusing issues of faith with issues of socioeconomic status. And since it deals with issues of class, I thought, Arlie, you could speak to this as well, but I'll let David, if you have any response or comments on that, feel free to start.
There are a lot of the social scientific surveys do show that the more education you have, the less religious you are by standard indicators. Now, there are massive exceptions to that rule, but it is overwhelmingly confirmed by modern social science. There's also a difference in the type of religion, the type of religious ideas that are popular at different class levels. One of the great books on this by Robert Putnam and David Campbell, called American Grace, established that of the, I think it's 30 or 40% of the US population that are the most religious by standard indicators, the most religious, these people overwhelmingly believe that the world was created 6,000 years ago. Now, there's no mystery as to where these people got these ideas. And there's no uncertainty about what segments of the clergy were in an authoritative position to disabuse the faithful of these illusions. And the problem here is that you have a vast evangelical clerisy that is bound only loosely by modern standards of epistemic plausibility. So yes, it's an educational difference, and therefore it's a class difference. The challenge, though, is, as everybody keeps saying, you have to meet people where they are. And if where they are is in this deep religious stuff and Christian nationalism, I don't think it helps very much to go to these people and say, you've got false consciousness.
Right.
I mean, you think that this is about religion, but let me tell you, it's really about class. I mean, I just don't think that's an effective way to do it. But the question reflects a true understanding of where we are and the character of the challenge we face.
Okay, let me just add what you said, David. You spoke of the evangelical clerisy and it as more powerful among foreign working people. I think that's true, but they are appealing to something that the Democratic left is ignoring. Let me give you an example. I'm working now in a town where coal jobs have gone out and opiate crisis has come in. It has disrupted and shaken the social foundations of this community. This is Putnam stuff, the whole bowling alone, people don't have the community that they did have. And I spoke actually recently with a guy who is recovering addict from part of the diseases of despair. And he said, I'm not a religious person. I was baptized in the Baptist church, but I don't go to church. But, I wouldn't mind a rise of the church because people are singing together. They're being in one room together. It would be some healing of a lost community. There's a whole disruption that's happened to blue collar America of not only are you losing your job or being earning a lot less and struggling, but you're less likely to be married, you're less likely to be volunteering for the baseball team, you're less likely to be going to meetings, you're more alone. And I think religion does offer some way of getting together with people that you presume are honest and good. I think the evangelical clerisy sees a vacuum, and that the Democrats are not looking at the vacuum that they see and are taking advantage of. And I'll say one more thing. When people are talking about church, sometimes I get a feeling of that the thing about it they like is that it looks like it's not going to change. These are risk averse, these are loss averse people who have lost a lot. Their community's gone downhill. They're in a depopulated rural town. Stores have closed, Walmart's come in, and they're shaken. And so when people talk about my church, I have a feeling that they're talking about like cement or something that's solid, unchangeable. And so we need to address, not just social class, but the kind of social solidarity that this group of people, many Americans, the losers of globalization, are experiencing.
I want to add that the latest studies on the evangelical clergy show that an unprecedented percentage of them, I don't remember the exact figure, I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't quote it, unprecedented percentage of evangelical clergy have been tempted during the last 2 years to quit. And the arguments that they make, or the explanations they make, is that they get these people 2 hours a week, and the rest of the time they're watching Tucker Carlson. And so that the effort, that the power that the intellectual, cultural, and social leaders of these evangelical churches have traditionally had is diminishing. So those evangelical clergy who might want to perform the enlightening role that I was celebrating a while ago are increasingly frustrated. Those who would like to do this will find that the parishioners will come back and say, well, what you're saying, Reverend, is very different than what I got from Sean Hannity last night. I mean, aren't you a real Christian? So there are a lot of indications that the standard for what it counts to be a real Christian is being set by Fox News. And if you want an example of it, you look at the experience of Representative Kinzinger, the Republican from Illinois, who's on the January 6th committee, when he spoke up in favor of impeachment, his family renounced him, and he released the long memorandum that he got from his dozens of cousins or so forth. And they said that we know that Trump is a true Christian and you are not. And the reason we know this, and that it listed 10 Fox News voices that had approved Trump. And so from the point of view of the average Assembly of God pastor, this is a real problem. I think Arlie is absolutely correct that traditionally these churches have performed a community function, and one of the big social changes that we experience in the United States today, that's less so. What is their community? Fox News.
Only half, though, are watching Fox News. I saw a recent survey. They may be I mean, watching a variety of other things. The people I'm talking to will tune in to MSNBC and CNN, see what they're doing. And then they would say, well, look, I'm fair. I'm looking at both sides. Now, they may be looking more at one side to another, but I think Fox is there, but our thinking can't stop with it.
I agree with that.
There is
But
a missing narrative on our side.
But the question would be, what is the community of the people that we're talking about? And I'll give you an example. Militias. Now, I follow pretty closely what goes on in my former state of Idaho and Montana and Wyoming. And those people are not confused about what their community is. There was a thing the other day where somebody running for state assembly in Idaho was confronted with somebody in the audience of a election rally. Person stood up and said, when are we going to be able to start shooting Democrats? Now, this guy then did not give the kind of civic speech that we might think was appropriate. He said, well, that's a good question, and then just went it off with a laugh.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm saying that
crazies.
there are
They're
these
crazies.
people. So I'm talking about different kinds of people. And Arlie, you're referring to those who are feeling a sense of loss of community. I'm talking about people who have found a community.
Well, that's right, but they have been lost before. If we look at who these guys are, a lot of them are, take the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. They're kind of lost. They're male. They're feeling lost, and they're a little bit in a crisis. They're a huge worry. They honestly, but the ones I've been talking to some of them, they're on drugs and drinkers and on fifth relationships. So I think you're right, they may have found a community, but they come from a lost community.
I don't dispute that, but I've been waiting for Mitch McConnell and McCarthy and the other leading Republicans to promise that when these militias begin to oppose federal agents, that they will support the federal government instead of temporalizing and saying, oh, well, these people have an issue here.
Okay.
We should reserve. I mean, I think that part of the grave danger that we have in this country right now is that the Republicans will not repudiate these people, lost or found.
Completely right. But if we just say, oh, they're impossible to talk to and it's a political act to deplore them, we're not doing all we can do. So I just end with it now.
All right.
Totally
so I will.
agree with
We got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to move on. I will say this, and those of you in my civility class will hear me say this again. I think, part of the problem we also have, going back to my point about political parties, is we have what I call secular evangelicals in our political discussions. And what I mean by that is we approach discussions between Democrats and Republicans as if we have to convert the other to the true religion. And, Arlie, I do appreciate your points about saying maybe we need to kind of just, two religions is okay. But there's that point. I'm going to address one last, we've got just 5 minutes left. There were a couple questions directed in my opening comments. I just want to address them. And then David and Arlie, if you'd like to follow up. I'm sure what I have to say may not fit comfortably, but that's how I roll. So I had a question here about, how can we equate what the Republicans are doing, what the Democrats are doing? It's a false equivalence because the Republicans are destroying democracy. And then other ones saying basically, what about the power to the unelected, unchecked Supreme Court? And so my response to this is I think it's an exact equivalence. I personally see the Democrats and Republicans almost in a dead heat in who can run democracy into the ground faster for electoral victory. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. The rhetoric of, for instance, you have to vote Democrat now because we have to pass the bill codifying Roe v. Wade so we can save America from that unelected, unchecked Supreme Court. I see this as 100% political spin. It's a misunderstanding, I think, of the Dobbs decision. And I think what it is it's risking long-term damage in terms of respect for one of the institutions of government for short-term electoral gain. And it's something I don't agree with. And what I mean by political spin is the fact that, oh wait, I just lost my train of thought. How did that happen? Oh, what I was gonna say is this rhetoric about the unelected, unaccountable Supreme Court, that's the way it was designed. It's supposed to be that way. So to describe it that way, it was supposed to be the one branch of government that wasn't part of the electoral cycle, and that's the way it was designed. And the bill that they're pushing through right now, which is the bill that codifies Roe v. Wade, is not designed to restore faith. It's actually doing what Clarence Thomas said by fixing the mistake. What the Dobbs decision did is it basically said the Supreme Court overreached in 1973. It pushed it back to states and said it's for Congress to pass laws, not for the Supreme Court. And now Congress is trying to do that. So I would say that when I say step back for the bigger picture, I don't see this as a one-sided issue. I think looking in the mirror and having a discussion that does reach across to others, as difficult as can be, and David's right, there are some people out there that don't want to have that discussion. There are the crazies, as Arlie called them. But I think there's a lot of fertile ground, whether it's the midterms or after, in basically, trying to find a path to understanding. I don't know if David or Arlie, you want to follow up with any insights on that?
On Roe v. Wade, I wouldn't start with that issue. I was talking to a stranger on the right who was in this middle, nearly half, who's the persuadable, so to speak. But I might say, freedom's really important. And do we really want the government to be making decisions as personal as whether you keep or abort a child? Is the government in your living room? Do you want the government there? So I would appeal that way.
David?
Well, I would have to add on this is that there are a lot of reasons to find fault with the Democrats, not only now, but in the past. But I believe that we're in a unique situation in the history of the way these parties work. Unique situation as to how one of the parties has been taken over by what in earlier times was a fairly marginal orientation. Therefore, I think it is absolutely essential for Republicans to be defeated at every level. And a danger for people like us is that we want to give a sort of too much ground. Oh, we have to have a lot of empathetic understanding for these people. Yes, I agree with Arlie on that. But when it comes to pushing people to make decisions, to bearing witness for democracy, I think there's only one issue, and that is the defeat of the Republican Party.
Okay, let me add to that the way of doing that, I think, involves developing our extraordinary skills for empathy. Empathy should not be misunderstood for weakness. It's not. It's, the greatest generals really are the most brilliant at reconnaissance, at knowing what people feel and why they feel that way. So it's not either or. I think you can really be effective or ineffective. And to be effective, we really need to hone our empathic skills.
Agreed, and that will be a beautiful way to bring us to the end of our town hall, because amazingly, an hour has actually flown by. Would that we had enough time to do these every week and keep the conversation going. But I do want to say, Arlie and David, thank you so much for your time and for your insights and your thoughts on all of this. I think you've left everybody with plenty of food for thought for weeks to come. I also want to thank all of you for being here and for showing up for this town hall. If you're in my civility class, feel free to bring in some questions for next week. I'm always happy to keep the conversation going as long as that class is running. But for now, going to have to sign off and say, tell everybody happy Friday and take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See you.